The US government considers China to be the greatest threat to its global dominance. Now, this is a bipartisan position that is shared by both Republicans and Democrats. However, the difference is that Democrats, like previous President Joe Biden, also see Russia as a major threat to the US, whereas some Republicans, and in particular Donald Trump, do not see Russia as a threat. Instead, the Trump administration proposed that the US should try to partner with Russia against China in order to try to weaken Beijing. Donald Trump himself claimed just a few days before the 2024 presidential election that he could divide Russia and China.
You never want Russia and China uniting. We united them. It's a shame. The stupidity of what they've done. Well, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that too. I have to ununite them.
Marco Rubio is a neoconservative politician who is serving as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in the Trump administration. He's one of the most powerful people in the U.S. government. And in his Senate confirmation hearing, he insisted that China is the greatest so-called threat to the U.S., and he argued that the history of the 21st century will be determined by U.S.-China conflict.
The Communist Party of China leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin. There's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places. But the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went.
This is why Marco Rubio even proposed that the U.S. could possibly partner with Russia geopolitically. And of course, he didn't say the quiet part loud, but we know that the reason he wants to do this is to weaken China.
The credible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest and frankly, economically.
However, the Trump administration is facing a big problem in its divide and conquer plans, which is that today, China and Russia are closer now than they have ever been. And this was further reinforced by a trip that China's President Xi Jinping took to Moscow this May, in which he met with Russia's President Putin, and both leaders emphasized that their relations are closer than ever. As Reuters noted in a report, China's President Xi described the two countries as, quote, friends of steel, end quote, and they pledged to raise cooperation to a new level to decisively counter the influence of the United States. In a lengthy joint statement, Beijing and Moscow called to, quote, strengthen coordination in order to decisively counter Washington's course of dual containment of Russia and China, end quote. Putin had invited President Xi to Moscow in order to celebrate the 80th anniversary of Victory Day on the 9th of May, the day when the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, and of course, the Soviet Union was allied at that time with China and also with the Western allied powers. And in World War II, the Soviet Union and China made by far the biggest contributions to defeating fascism. This is why the Washington Post, which is a very anti-Russian newspaper, even they acknowledged in an important article published back in 2015 on the 70th anniversary of Victory Day, they said, quote, don't forget how the Soviet Union saved the world from Hitler, end quote. Historians have found that 26 to 27 million Soviets died in World War II, which is known officially in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, and 3/4 of Nazi casualties were on the Eastern Front at the hands of the Soviet Red Army. The Western Allies were only responsible for 1/4 of Nazi casualties. This is why even the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was a virulent anti-communist and a dedicated colonialist who oversaw many colonial crimes in British colonies, even Churchill admitted in 1944, quote, "I have always believed and I still believe that it is the Red Army that has torn the guts out of the filthy Nazis," end quote. But while a lot of that history is not known in the West, and Western governments have been trying to erase the very important contribution of the Soviet Union to defeating Nazism and fascism, that already is not nearly known enough in the West. But what's even less known in the West is the contribution made by China. At least 14 million Chinese people died in World War II fighting against the Japanese Empire. And for the people of China, World War II started 2 years before it started in Europe. It started in Europe in 1939. It started in Asia in 1937 with the Japanese invasion of China and the colonization and conquest of Chinese territory. And according to official Chinese statistics, 20 million Chinese people died fighting against the Japanese Empire in World War II. And the Japanese Empire also was at war with other parts of Asia, colonizing other parts of Asia, including Vietnam. And this is why top Vietnamese officials were also invited to Moscow to celebrate the 80th anniversary of Victory Day of the defeat of fascism in World War II. Later on in this analysis, I'm going to talk more about Vietnam and the other countries that participated in this anniversary celebration in Russia. First, I want to further analyze the increasingly close relations between Beijing and Moscow, and I'm going to look at official statements made by Putin and Xi that demonstrate that the Trump administration's attempt to divide Russia and China are completely failing. Now, these statements were the official comments made by Putin and Xi at a press conference. A transcript of this was published by the Kremlin. You can find it on the Kremlin website from the 8th of May. Putin began by referring to Xi as his dear friend. And then Putin said that China-Russia relations have, quote, reached the highest level in history, being self-sufficient and independent from internal political factors or momentary global agendas, end quote. So that's Putin's indirect way of saying, okay, yeah, there's a new administration in Washington, and Trump wants to be friends with me, and he wants to divide us from the Chinese. That's not going to work. This is a momentary global agenda. Putin is saying that Russia's relations with China are much deeper and much more long-term. He continued, Putin said that, quote, the comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between Russia and China are built on the unshakable principles of equality, mutual support, and assistance, as well as the unbreakable friendship between the two states and two nations, end quote. Putin then went on describing the many ways in which Moscow and Beijing have been deepening their relations. He noticed that there's been significant progress in Russian-Chinese trade and investment. He noted that China is Russia's leading trade partner, and this is very important. Putin emphasized that both countries are conducting bilateral payments in national currencies. That is, they are de-dollarizing. They've removed the US dollar from their trade. Putin said, quote, nearly all Russian-Chinese trade transactions are now carried out in rubles and yuan. In effect, a stable and resilient mutual trade system has been established, one that is reliably shielded from the influence of third countries and adverse fluctuations in global markets, end quote. So this is Putin's way of saying, yes, the US is trying to divide us, and the US is waging economic war now against China. Trump has 145% tariffs on China. The previous trade war that Trump started against China in 2018 has been escalated basically to a nuclear level. Essentially, Trump has declared a trade embargo on China. And what Putin is saying in this press conference is that third countries, i.e. the US, are not going to divide this deep relationship we have with China, which is at the best level we've ever had. And as an example, he emphasized that China and Russia are very committed to de-dollarization, and they're already doing basically all of their trade in their own local currencies. And Putin also explained how they're building more infrastructure to integrate the countries, including gas pipelines like the Power of Siberia pipeline. Now, this is a point that the Trump administration really does not appear to understand, because Trump insisted that he could divide Russia and China by offering a few political concessions to Russia. But the reality is that China is Russia's largest trading partner, and in the past few years, their economic relations have deepened very significantly, and trade between China and Russia more than doubled between 2020 and 2023. 30.5% of Russia's exports go to China, which is a massive increase from just around 5% in 2000. And similarly, 36.5% of Russia's imports come from China, which is an increase from around 2% in 2000. Moreover, Russia and China have very complementary economies. Russia is one of the world's largest producers and exporters of important commodities like oil, gas, minerals, foodstuffs, wheat and other grains, also fertilizers. And China needs a lot of food. It has 1.4 billion people it needs to feed. And China needs a lot of commodities, of raw materials, in order to manufacture its goods. China is the world's largest manufacturer. The United States, on the other hand, has deindustrialized its economy, and the US is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. So in fact, the US is in many ways a competitor with Russia, fighting over global market share in the oil and gas market, and also in terms of agricultural exports, because like Russia, the US is a major exporter of food. So whereas the economies of China and Russia are very complementary, the economies of the US and Russia are not complementary. They're competitors. So the fact of the matter is that the US can't offer Russia what China is offering Russia. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. The only thing that the Trump administration can offer Russia is security guarantees and the promise that NATO will not continue to expand eastward. But Russia can no longer trust the United States because the US previously claimed that, and NATO continued to expand eastward multiple times. And the only other thing that the Trump administration can offer Russia is an end to US sanctions on Russia. However, Moscow cannot trust Washington because let's say another president comes in 4 years and reverses everything that Trump did and puts more sanctions on Russia. So Putin has made it clear that the political and economic future of Russia lies in deepening its political and economic integration with China and with Asia in general, with Eurasian integration, recognizing that Russia is now part of Eurasia. It's been kicked out of the West. And the statements that both Russia and China made about the United States during this trip were very strong. And as an example of this, President Xi published an article in a Russian newspaper in which he compared the US empire to fascism during the 1930s and 40s. President Xi wrote, quote, "The just forces of the world, including China and the Soviet Union, fought bravely and defeated the arrogant fascist forces side by side," end quote. And then the Chinese leader added, quote, 80 years later, unilateralism, hegemony, and bullying are extremely harmful. Humanity is once again at the crossroads," end quote. So this was a pretty clear implication that China was comparing the US empire today, which tries to dominate the entire world, with Hitler and Nazi Germany, which also tried to dominate all of Europe with plans to eventually dominate the rest of the world. In their diplomatic statements, Beijing and Moscow emphasized how they share many common understandings and how both countries are pushing for a multipolar world. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry emphasized that they signed more than 20 bilateral cooperation documents and, quote, the two sides are good neighbors that cannot be moved away, true friends, end quote. And they said that their relationship, quote, is not subject to restrictions from any third party, end quote. They're, of course, talking about the US. Now, here I'm going to briefly look at the comments that were made by President Xi in this press conference he held in Moscow with Putin. Xi Jinping emphasized that Russia is the country he has visited most frequently as president of the People's Republic of China. This marked his 11th visit to Russia, and Xi described the, quote, great growth and great leapfrog in China-Russia relations, end quote. And Xi described how they are facing, quote, global, epoch-making, and historical changes, end quote. This is a reference to a phrase that President Xi has often repeated, which is that we are seeing changes in the world that haven't been seen in 100 years. And he emphasizes that China and Russia are at the center of those changes. And what are they based on? China emphasized that they're based on mutual benefit and win-win cooperation. Chinese is a very poetic language, and Chinese officials often use metaphors. And for instance, President Xi described the high-speed train of China-Russia mutually beneficial cooperation. He added that they, quote, continuously promote an equal and orderly multipolar world, end quote. And that was a term that was used many times in the statements made by both Putin and Xi. Multipolarity, that they're building a multipolar world. And as an example of this multipolar world, President Xi and Putin emphasized the importance of organizations like BRICS, founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, brings together Eurasian countries originally to focus on security issues, but since then it's expanded and they now also focus on political and economic issues. And it includes China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, which recently joined, Kazakhstan, and several other Central Asian nations. I mean, these are some of the biggest and most populous countries on Earth. And in this meeting in Moscow, Xi and Putin called to strengthen the SCO along with BRICS. So with these public statements, it's very clear that Russia and China are still very close partners, and the Trump administration's attempt to divide them is failing. It's not working. And this has been a strategy that's been discussed for years in Washington, with think tanks asking if Trump can pull what they call a reverse Nixon to divide Russia from China. This is a reference to the visit that former US President Richard Nixon took to China in 1972. He met with Chinese leader Mao Zedong, and essentially, China did ally with the US against the Soviet Union. But that was a very different political situation. That came after the very tumultuous period of the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, and at that time, the Soviet Union and China hated each other. They had ideological disagreements, political differences, economic differences, even military threats. So when the US allied with China in the 1970s, it was much more plausible because Beijing and Moscow were already fighting. Whereas today, the situation is completely different. Trump wants to do the opposite. He wants to ally with Russia against China, but Russia and China today are closer than they've ever been. And that was repeatedly reaffirmed by Putin and Xi. But also, the situation today economically is completely different compared to the 1970s. Back then, China was still a very poor country. It was not a major industrial power. Today, China is the world's largest economy, representing nearly 20% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity. China's economy has been larger than the US economy since 2016, and China's share of the global economy continues to grow every year, whereas the US share of the global economy is under 15% and shrinking year by year. Moreover, China today is the world's manufacturing superpower, representing around 1/3 of global manufacturing output. We're no longer in the 1970s. China is one of the most advanced economies on Earth. So why would Russia sacrifice its relations with China, its closest partner, in order to ally with the US when China is the one rising in influence politically and economically in the world, whereas the US is obviously declining in influence politically, economically? The US has deindustrialized. The reality is that China can offer Russia much more than the United States can, and this is why the Trump administration strategy was doomed to fail. And let's be clear here, this actually was not just Donald Trump's strategy. There have been many hawks in Washington who have fantasized about doing this triangulation strategy for years, including the late war criminal Henry Kissinger. Kissinger served as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor for Nixon back in the 70s, like Marco Rubio is doing in the Trump administration today. And in 1971, took a secret trip to Beijing where he met with Mao, and he set the stage for the US normalization of relations with China. So back when Trump became president during his first term, starting in 2017, Kissinger actually personally advised Trump to try to ally with Russia in order to isolate China. This has been popularly referred to as a reverse Kissinger strategy. However, I would actually say it's not a reverse Kissinger, it's just a Kissingerian strategy. Because this is what Kissinger had always advocated for, going back to 1972, when Nixon visited China. And you can see this very clearly if you look at the documents published by the State Department's Office of the Historian. There is a very interesting conversation between Nixon and Kissinger in 1972. Kissinger said very clearly that after allying with China against Russia, later the US should ally with Russia against China. I'm reading here, this is an exact quote from what Kissinger said in 1972. Quote, "I think in a historical period, they, the Chinese, are more formidable than the Russians. And I think in 20 years, your successor," he's speaking to Nixon, "your successor, if he's as wise as you, will wind up leaning toward the Russians against the Chinese. For the next 15 years, we have to lean toward the Chinese against the Russians. We have to play this balance of power game totally unemotionally. Right now, we need the Chinese to correct the Russians and to discipline the Russians." End quote. That was what Kissinger said at the exact time when the US was normalizing relations with China. So, Kissinger was this Machiavellian imperialist. Everything he did was about expanding the power of the US empire. He described it as a balance of power game. So it was not a reverse Kissinger. This was always the strategy that was being advocated. And in fact, it was not just Trump who has tried to do this. Even the Obama administration tried to do this. If you go back to Obama's first term in 2009, when Hillary Clinton, another neoconservative war hawk, when she was serving as Secretary of State, overseeing U.S. foreign policy, famously in 2009, Clinton met with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and she famously gave him a red button, and they symbolically pushed the red button. And the U.S. said that this was a Russia reset button. They were trying to reset U.S.-Russia relations. Then, 2 years later, the Obama administration announced its so-called Pivot to Asia strategy, which was essentially an acknowledgement that the U.S. was preparing for a future war with China. The U.S. empire wanted to move its troops and military resources out of West Asia, the Middle East, and move those troops and military equipment to East Asia to prepare for an upcoming war with China. And that's why they wanted to reset Russia relations first, so Russia would not be an issue, so they could focus all of the attention of the US empire on containing and weakening China. However, obviously this strategy did not work, and this was for a variety of reasons. One, the 2008-2009 financial crisis in the US, which was a wake-up call to many countries that the US financial system was built on a big house of cards, that the US economy was built on a big bubble. And furthermore, you had the creation of BRICS in 2009, Russia is the R in BRICS. It's one of the founding members. And then, of course, you had the expansion of NATO eastward, closer and closer to Russia's borders, which angered Moscow. And finally, you had the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, which overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected president, who had been geopolitically neutral, trying to balance the West and Russia, and the installation of a pro-Western regime that vowed to join NATO, which was then followed by Western sanctions against Russia. And meanwhile, throughout all of this time, China is growing to become the world's largest economy and manufacturing superpower, and Russia's trade with China throughout this time is growing significantly as well. So all of these factors together made the US imperial strategy of trying to reset relations with Russia and pivot to Asia for containing China. That strategy failed. And now the Donald Trump administration is doing a last-ditch effort, the last desperate attempt to divide China and Russia, and clearly they have failed miserably. And you can see this very clearly reflected in the long joint statement that was published by the Russian government and the Chinese government. Now, there's not an official English language translation of this full statement, which is more than 8,000 words. The Chinese government published a version in Chinese, and the Russian government published one in Russian. However, the Chinese journalist Fred Gao published an unofficial translation of the full statement, and I want to go through some of the main points. He noted that this was quite similar to another 8,000-word joint statement that was published by China and Russia in May of 2024. However, this Chinese journalist, Fred Gao, highlighted two main differences. One of them is this new statement has more direct criticism of the United States. It doesn't just use vague language like certain countries, which is often what these statements say. They say certain countries are engaging in hegemonic practices. In this case, the statement says very clearly that they are, quote, resolutely responding to the U.S. dual containment policy against China and Russia, end quote, and that both sides clearly oppose, quote, attempts by the United States and its allies to advance NATO's eastward expansion into the Asia-Pacific, end quote. So I want to spend a few minutes here going through some of the highlights of this very long joint statement. It begins reflecting on the history of World War II, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, known in China as the World Anti-Fascist War. And they noted that, quote, China and the Soviet Union, as the main battlefields in Asia and Europe respectively, stood at the forefront against Japanese militarism and Nazi Germany and their vassal states, serving as the two main forces in the fight against militarism and fascism, end quote. They noted that, quote, the defeat of Japanese militarism and Nazi Germany announced the bankruptcy of the fascist plot to dominate the world with anti-human ideology and completely shattered their attempts to enslave peoples of all countries. And what's related to that, which is very important, is China and Russia say that today we're seeing a resurgence of some of these extremist, racist, and fascist ideologies. And they wrote in this joint statement, quote, the two sides are committed to preventing the resurgence of anti-human, Nazi, and racial superiority ideologies, and will continue to jointly resist the beautification of Nazis and their accomplices, the rise of neo-Nazism, the revival of militarism, and acts that encourage various forms of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, end quote. And of course, a big implication here is that the United States is reviving fascism and racism. In the second part of this joint statement, they emphasized that, quote, China-Russia relations have reached the highest level in history and continue to develop stably in all directions, setting an example for building a new type of international relations and becoming a model for cooperation, end quote. They emphasized that China and Russia have extensive common interests and their overall development goals are complementary. This is a very important quote here. China-Russia relations have unique strategic value and strong internal driving force, neither targeting any third party nor subject to the influence of any third party, end quote. So what they're saying here is that a third party, i.e. the US, is not going to be able to divide us because we have our own internal reasons, economic, political, military, that drive us together. We have complementary interests. And they wrote that they will, quote, always regard each other as priority cooperation partners, jointly resist any attempts to interfere with and disrupt the traditional friendship and deep mutual trust between China and Russia, end quote. So this is a huge sign they're saying to the world, and in particular to Donald Trump and the US government, you will not divide us. Going on, Moscow and Beijing discussed the various ways in which they are deepening their cooperation, including through the development of trade, deepening investment cooperation, energy cooperation, financial cooperation, including local currency settlement, that is de-dollarization, the construction of China-Russia border port infrastructure, industrial cooperation, the consolidation of industrial supply chains, and technological cooperation, including on scientific research and artificial intelligence, AI. Then, later on in the statement, Russia and China describe the many ways in which their foreign policy is complementary and how they see the world in a very similar way and want a multipolar world. They both upheld international law and the principles of the UN Charter, and they defended the, quote, international system with the United Nations at its core, end quote. This language is very important because what China and Russia are doing here is responding to the idea of the so-called rules-based international order, which is advocated by the US and its Western allies. And essentially, the whole idea of the rules-based international order is an attempt to replace the international law-based order. Because what are the rules? They're arbitrary. They're vague. In fact, it's the US that makes the rules and orders everyone else around. And the US makes the rules in the interest of the US and the West more generally, against the interest of the global South and the global majority. So China and Russia are clearly saying there is no so-called rules-based international order. There is an international law-based order centered at the United Nations, and China and Russia are defending that system. And both sides emphasized that, quote, building a more equitable and sustainable multipolar world order is the trend of the times, end quote. However, they added, unfortunately, quote, certain countries addicted to hegemonism and neocolonialism implement aggressive policies and limit the sovereignty of other countries and suppress their economic and technological development to protect their own privileges, which does not align with the trend of world multipolarity and democratization of international relations, end quote. So here, when they say certain countries, they're obviously talking about the United States. And they're saying that the US is trying to prevent the move toward a more multipolar world, which really means a more democratic world in which other countries have more of a say in international affairs and determine how global governance institutions should operate. What China and Russia are saying is that the US empire and its attempt to maintain global hegemony go against democracy. They're authoritarian. They're imperialist. And as an example of this growing multipolarity in the world, this joint statement names organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, calling to strengthen its coordination. And of course, BRICS. China and Russia call to strengthen BRICS cooperation in the fields of trade, finance, minerals, digital economy, public health, technological innovation, artificial intelligence, connectivity, governance, and other areas, and promote BRICS countries to strengthen research and cooperation on bilateral trade settlement in local currencies, international financial architecture reform, sustainable development, and other issues. So in other words, de-dollarization. What China and Russia are saying is that BRICS and these other institutions are platforms, vehicles for the creation of a more multipolar and democratic world order, one that is not completely dominated by the United States and the Western imperial powers that colonized most of the world and today continue trying to impose neo-colonial policies on the rest of the world. So what all of this makes clear beyond a doubt is that Russia recognizes that its political and economic future lies in deepening its integration with Eurasia, especially with China, but also India and other major Asian countries, and more generally with the global South, which now in Russia they refer to as the global majority because, Russia is not in the southern hemisphere, at least geographically, but politically, economically, Russia is now part of the larger family of the global South as a political group, just like the West is not only a geographic idea. I mean, the idea of the West is a political construct. It's not geographic. First of all, the planet is a sphere, so there is no objective West and East. In fact, in Asia, many world maps put Eurasia and Africa on the western side, on the left side of the map, and they put the Americas on the right side. But anyway, the point is that Russia has made it clear that it's part of the global majority along with the global South. And we can see this very clearly reflected in the diplomatic meetings that President Putin held with world leaders in May on the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of Victory Day, of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. One of the other major world leaders who joined Putin, along with China's President Xi, was Brazil's president, Lula da Silva. And Brazil, of course, was one of the co-founders of BRICS, and Brazil is the B in BRICS. Also invited to participate in the celebration in Moscow was Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. Of course, Venezuela is a country that has been fighting against U.S. imperialism. The U.S. has imposed illegal unilateral sanctions and an economic blockade aimed at trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. And the U.S. government has backed many coup attempts trying to overthrow Venezuela's presidents. Not only Maduro, but also his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And both of them were democratically elected. And yet the U.S. has constantly tried to violate the sovereignty of Venezuela. Also invited to meet with Putin in Moscow was the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, another country that has been a victim of U.S. imperialism for more than 60 years. The U.S. government has tried to suffocate the Cuban economy and the people of Cuba with an illegal unilateral embargo, a blockade that violates international law. And every single year at the United Nations General Assembly, almost every country on earth except the U.S. and Israel, basically every other country, votes to condemn this illegal U.S. embargo and demand that it's lifted. So the fact that Cuba, along with Venezuela and Brazil, these Latin American countries, were represented in Russia, shows that this is a priority in Russia's foreign policy. But it wasn't just Latin America. You also had leaders from Africa represented, including the leader of Zimbabwe and the new revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, who is a young military leader who was inspired by the previous revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara. And Traoré has openly called for resisting imperialism and neo-colonialism. He's a Pan-Africanist who has called for uniting the African continent against Western neo-colonialism. And he wants to unite not only Africa, but the global South and the global majority against Western imperialism. And the fact that he was invited to Moscow and had a one-on-one meeting with Putin was very symbolic. Also symbolic was the invitation of the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. Now, a lot of Palestinians have rightfully criticized Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen, for collaborating with the Israeli occupation. He's very unpopular, but the reality is that Russia recognizes Palestine as a state, along with many global South countries. The majority of global South countries, and even some European countries, officially recognize Palestine as a state. The U.S. has been standing in the way of international law, unilaterally blocking the recognition of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. And because Russia has state-to-state relations with Palestine, Putin had to invite the internationally recognized president of the state of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas. So regardless of the many very real and important criticisms of Abbas by the Palestinian people, this was a very symbolic move, and it showed that Russia was reaffirming its support for Palestine. Moreover, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, To Lam, was also invited to Moscow and had a one-on-one meeting with Putin. And Russia and Vietnam said they're going to continue to strengthen their ties. They are very close partners, and their relations only get closer and closer. Now, this came just a few days after China's President Xi visited Southeast Asia and met with the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. And Beijing and Hanoi signed more than 40 bilateral agreements deepening their cooperation. This is very important because what this shows is that Vietnam is not joining the U.S. in the new Cold War that Washington is waging against Beijing. If you read U.S. think tanks, if you read, for instance, the RAND Corporation, which is an arm of the U.S. military, they all have been saying for years that the U.S. should try to recruit Vietnam as an ally against China, to try to isolate and weaken China. Just like, for years, the U.S. has been trying to ally with Russia against China. And in both attempts, the U.S. has failed. Vietnam has remained independent and non-aligned, and Russia's partnership with China is closer than it's ever been. So what all of this shows is that the Trump administration, previously before the Biden administration, then before that, the Obama administration, imperial strategists in Washington have failed in their attempt to divide China and Russia, to divide Vietnam and Russia and Vietnam and China, in their attempt to try to impose U.S. hegemony on the rest of the world. What we see is an increasingly multipolar world, and the United States will have to accept that it's just one country among 193 countries in the world recognized by the United Nations. And yes, the US is always going to be a powerful country with a big population and a big economy, but it must accept that the rest of the world is sovereign. The US cannot be a global empire that imposes its hegemony on the rest of the world. But unfortunately, in Washington, you have US imperial strategists and policymakers who refuse to accept that reality, and that's why they're waging a new Cold War against China and trying to isolate and destabilize China to maintain their global dominance, which is going to fail, just as their attempt to divide Russia and China have failed. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.